Check those clocks, Chris.
Yeah.
It's the day of birth, not the day of death. Did you know that?
For some people. I mean,
well, I guess,
Josh, this is a morbid opening.
You made it morbid. What I was going to say is it's the clock's about to turn August, which means I'm ready to get hurt again, Chris.
You're ready to get hurt again.
I got my
You
Tennessee
mean as a fan of the? Yeah, I was going to
mug.
say the Titans and the Vols.
Usually the Vols are the ones that will break my heart. It's the Titans that are just kind of like, oh, that was fun. Mm-hmm. You know, it helps being out of market, living in Wisconsin. The Titans aren't. The Tennessee Volunteers have the heart of the state because they've been there so much longer.
Sure.
And yesterday, well, as of recording this yesterday, I was preaching Ecclesiastes 7, the day of death is better than the day of birth. And I said, the day of birth is NFL training camp, guys.
Yeah.
Everyone's got a shot. Your team could win the Super Bowl.
For the Titans, the day of death is first week, actually, of the season, typically, at least for the past few years.
Although, isn't there some interesting statistics on teams that lose week one?
I'm not sure. I don't keep track of those stats.
I think week one is a liar. That's the phrase. Week one is a liar.
I believe that. Totally believe that.
It's when you're 0-5. That's the truth. That's
there's a lot
the
of
month
truth
of
there.
death. Yeah. So we hope that this podcast is more on the optimistic side, the day of birth side. Try to make you laugh a little bit. If you cry, we will not take credit for that, no matter how much you blame us.
I can take credit for it, Josh. I'm used to disappointing people all the time.
Okay, so that's Chris Tillman. He's going to take your credit for all of your tears. I'm Josh Holland. I want to be the happy guy today.
Take credit for all of your joy. That will be Josh. Josh and Joy, Chris and...
Cry.
Cry, exactly.
Josh and Joy, Chris and Cry. This is a time to think where we seek to helpfully and occasionally goodly thoughtfully, carefully engage with issues.
Even bigly.
Issues in the culture and the church. We have been meandering through a series called Pluralism, a failed project. So far, the podcast hasn't been a failed project, but we've tried to talk about the fact that for years, the atmosphere, the zeitgeist, the cultural agreement is...
The milieu, if you will.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Every religion is basically the same. All are good. They all lead to the same place. That's pluralism in a nutshell. And we've called it a failed project because we see the kind of chaos that happens morally, not just in individual morality, but also in how we can't converse with another person about what is good, what is right, what is true. There's chaos. We don't understand each other when we're talking to each other. We don't act the same ways. Oftentimes, there are clashes between religious groups. And so the whole pluralism thing didn't go great. And so what we're trying to do is say, because in part we see the effects of pluralism, but also because we see the falsity of pluralism, we want to look at different religious positions and discuss the distinctions, because we as Christian people need to be good at graciously saying something like, nope, that's wrong, or nope, I disagree. Because we don't have to just go along to get along and say, no, yeah, that's...
You don't have to hate somebody to disagree with them.
No. It's actually kind to be clear, even when it's disagreement. Yeah. And so we've talked about Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses. Those are the two that claim to be Christian groups, but we've seen have just chasms of differences in how their understanding of God. We have talked about Islam, which is the world's second leading religion, claims to be built off the back of the prophets of Christianity, but makes significant alterations. In a future episode, we're going to talk about two groups that are closer to Protestantism, the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. We want to focus on why people are drawn to those.
Especially of late.
Late?
This is a phenomenon that a lot of Gen Zers have gravitated more towards. We'll say the traditional, formalized, what purport to be ancient branches of Christianity. Yeah. And I think that'll be a great discussion, honestly, especially where we live, central Wisconsin. There's a high percentage of Roman Catholics. Yep. And I think that'll be valid. But I just had a conversation with a young man 2-3 weeks ago that came from a Lutheran evangelical upbringing, converted to Rome. So that's been helpful, just as I'm wondering, boots on the ground, what's this like? So that's where we're going. We've also talked about where we've been. Where are we today? Today we're going to talk about two opposite groups that share one thing in common. The opposite groups are theological liberals and maybe you call mystics or New Age. Sure.
And the thing they have in common is it's not the position they take on this, but the issue itself, which is supernaturalism. Effectively, we're going to boil down liberalism or liberal forms of Christianity into the denial of the supernatural. Mm-hmm. Whereas you also see at the same time a rise in mysticism, a rise in New Age, a rise in talk about things like auras and
crystals, incense.
It could be as bad as witchcraft, or it could be as simple as the movie Frozen 2, which we'll talk about at maybe not at some length. You'll probably shut me down at some point. I watched it last night. But the point being is that there's this issue, supernaturalism, and one modern group is effectively denying it outright. Mm-hmm. That's where a lot of the denials of Christian doctrine come from, is the denial of the supernatural. And then another group is not Christian, largely, but expresses some renewed interest in the supernatural, but tries to force it upon other things in the world, or at times does the a la carte thing where they pick and choose. And
right.
So we're talking effectively two sides of the same coin, supernaturalism. Are you familiar with J. Gresham Machen's, or is it Machen?
Machen, yeah, I've never met him, but no. Christianity and Liberalism is his kind of landmark work that was, if you're looking for information here on my part, when we think about J. Gresham Machen,
I was talking a lot, so I figured at some point I should ask you.
Give me a chance. That's fine.
So you could make people cry.
Yeah, exactly. So here begin the tears for those who are listening. So Machen was a Presbyterian clergyman and Presbyterian theologian who saw that the trajectory of the Protestant church in the United States and Europe had veered so far away from biblical fidelity.
We're talking early 1900s.
Yeah, early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, depends on when we want to kind of locate some of this stuff. And we'll talk about this more with theological liberalism in a minute, but there are certain theologians that, you and I, going through seminary, we had to read some of their stuff, we had to talk about them, think about them, that what they said and did set the stage for what then developed in the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, what develops is a view of Christianity that effectively removes the exclusivity of Jesus, the claims of Jesus to be God in the flesh, the miracles of Jesus worked to demonstrate his authority over all of creation, and basically this thread that's running through what becomes known as theological liberalism is that it's okay to deny historic core cardinal truths of the Christian faith and still call oneself a Christian.
Okay.
So Machen comes on the scene then in the
So you could see a connection there between that and Mormonism or Jehovah's Witness. Yeah. A group claiming the name of Christ, but denying certain core components of it.
Yeah. And what's interesting as we'll talk about this is that the work of the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons, and a group we didn't even talk about, the Seventh-day Adventists or the, quote, Christian Scientists, these are all people that come out of the same time period. People coming out of the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century.
That's interesting.
Who are all originating typically out of New England. And Machen is at Princeton, right? And so Princeton is obviously in New England. Princeton had been an historically, wonderful school. In old Princeton, we have B.B. Warfield, people like that. And Princeton is where Edwards was the original president. At
like 2 weeks, right?
Yeah, a couple days, and then the old vaccine got him. But when we're looking at Machen basically has this not moment of clarity, but it's a literary moment of clarity. He publishes a book, Christianity and Liberalism. And this book is effectively seeking, and does quite well, it's an important book in 20th century Christian history, to basically say you cannot call yourself a Christian and maintain a denial of core Christian truths.
Yeah.
Now it seems very basic to us today, but it's important.
And it seems harsh. One of the reasons we want to do this particular series is we have to learn how to say stark things in a gracious manner.
Yes.
Maybe not even gracious, but just not a malicious manner.
Yes.
To say,
truthful, plain.
To say if you deny core components of Christianity, you are not a Christian, is a stark thing to say in our culture, because who am I to tell you, Chris? But it has to be said. And so we have to get good as Christians. What is correct your opponents with gentleness?
Right.
That means correct. It just means do it in a certain manner of behavior.
Yeah.
Can I ask, Chris, do you know why liberal theology is called liberal theology? We maybe have a confusion of even the term liberal, because you have classical liberalism, you have modern liberalism, which other people call progressivism. Now you've got this thing called liberalism theologically. What is that word liberal? What does it mean? And why is it attached by Machen to a denial of core components?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a personal thing for both of us, because we both grew up in liberal Protestant churches.
Yeah.
Right. Mainline. So another term that
mine was
you
like
may have heard.
Center left theologically, if you will.
Yeah. And mine was growing up, and then it went way off the grid after, I hit my 20s and everything. So the reason why it's called liberal is because when we think about conservative, what does conserve mean? It means to kind of hold on to a way of doing things that's rooted in history or tradition, those types of things. And liberalism, theological liberalism, is basically saying we can and should move past this. We can and should move past this and make improvements, because over time we have come to believe, understand, see certain things. And so we're going to move in that direction. Now, I appreciate the question being asked, Josh, because what we're not addressing today are Christian people who vote for Democrats.
Right. There's a difference.
Yeah. We're not addressing Christian people who advocate for single payer health. We're not advocating, we're not looking for this to be a discussion of people whose politics, even though there is overlap, to be very clear, typically speaking,
the idea of moving past an established tradition is going to have implications in multiple different avenues.
Yeah. I mean, in my undergraduate work, doing a philosophy of law and constitutional interpretation, things like that, it even affects like constitutional interpretation. So when you're talking about jurisprudence and judges on the Supreme Court, questions they get asked, how do you interpret the Constitution? There are liberal ways and conservative ways of interpreting the Constitution. Yeah. What people should know, again, that's not a political statement. It's a jurisprudential statement, which means those who interpret it conservatively, we might call them strict constructionists, originalists, things like that, are those who say, what did the framers of the Constitution, what did those who ratified amendments to the Constitution, what was their intent when they wrote it? When we look at it, how do we understand it? And then how do we apply it as it was framed, as it was ratified? Whereas a theological liberal or a jurisprudential liberal will look at source material and say, we know better, and we're not going to be bound to these things because we've developed, we've evolved, we've moved past, and we might reference this, but it's really not going to constrain how we do things.
So it's a difference between authorial intent would be one way. So what did the author intend? And we would argue that's how you read a text message.
Correct.
If
you read into it, you're going to have a bad relationship, right?
If my wife says, I'd like you to go to the grocery store on the way home, I assume she means go to the grocery store on the way home. Mm-hmm. And I don't go home and say, I thought you just meant you'd like that.
Right.
Like, I thought if you like some things and you don't like some things. So I didn't do it because I just thought you were, no, I kind of know the intent behind it.
Yeah.
So there's one school of interpretation, authorial intent. And then, and that's what we do on a Sunday theologically, is we say, we work as hard as we can to say, what did Paul mean when he wrote Romans? And we want that to bind whatever it could still mean for us today. But then there's reader response theory, which effectively centers the meaning in the reader. Mm-hmm. What do I experience, feel, think, believe based on what I'm reading? And those are two very different things. One of them is constrained to a certain discipline of understanding the past, and one of them is less constrained and is based on the person. So that's good. I'm glad you defined it.
And it does have, ultimately, Josh, an issue with authority. And I do think I want to address that right now, because we've talked about this in previous episodes. Where is the authority in different worldviews, in different religions? And for biblical Christianity, the Christianity that is, you open the pages of the Bible, what's going to come out of it is that there is an authority that's centered ultimately in God. And that authority then is delegated for purposes of doctrine to prophets and apostles. And the biblical teaching regarding the prophets and apostles as authoritative, inspired sources or conduits, I guess you should even say, of this divine information, is that it is God's authority mediated through a human author. And there is no more authority to be had apart from what God, we believe, has spoken in his word. Where theological liberalism, where the Jehovah's Witnesses, where Mormons, where all these different groups start deviating from that is to say, well, we have some new information, and we believe that this new information, even though it is completely contradictory to the previous information, whereas we can open up 66 books of the Bible and say, these agree, they're in accordance with each other, they will say, and as we talk about Roman Catholicism in the next couple of weeks, what we'll see is that an authority structure is then subverted biblically, so that the apostles and prophets, having completed that course, well, now we have a pope, or now we have the restoration through Joseph Smith. And with theological liberals, the authority is tied to the you said like reader response theory, but it is tied to the individual's experience.
Yeah.
Now this fits in with what our first podcast was about. We talked about this, the rise and triumph of the modern self.
Oh man, deep cut.
Yeah, we're going back, but it's really religion in theological liberalism is not rooted in historical facts. It's not rooted in an authority that comes from God. The authority belongs to the individual to experience as he or she will. So.
Okay, so there's some background. As far as liberalism goes, I want to talk, I guess let's just briefly talk about why J. Gresham Machen would make the move to say this is called liberalism and not liberal Christianity.
Right. Because you made this point before.
Yeah, so what was he seeing or what doctrines was he seeing get denied that he said, no, this is so significant that we can't say there's Presbyterian Christianity and Baptist Christianity and liberal Christianity. We need to say there's Christianity and liberalism, just like we're saying there's Christianity and Islam. What is he seeing that makes that move necessary?
Yeah, I mean, for those who took U.S. history, which I trust everybody. If you're an adult, you've taken U.S. history.
It's just if you remember it.
If you remember, yeah. I mean, I remember. I will say the teacher I had, AP U.S. history, 10th grade teacher. She was. I say this in the most loving way possible. Little eccentric because she used markers. All of her students had to have markers. Black, blue, red, green markers, and she would have you underline. Now she taught very well, and this was a helpful thing for people to like good learning.
The right
pedagogy,
eccentricity in a history class is probably helpful because you need a certain energy or passion behind it to make it not.
Yes, she would talk about how I think Zachary Taylor was a very attractive man. It's just that we've got some. It was
historically
endearing.
Objectifiable?
He was a good-looking guy.
He's objectifiable.
He's a good-looking dude. Yeah. So anyways, you get to this century mark of 1900, and what had happened. If we look at the broader historical context, the mid 1800s, you find a couple of things occurring that are on the heels of what we'll call Enlightenment thought. So if we want to locate the beginning of the Enlightenment in Western, history, we want to locate that in the 1700s. And so you have the advent of Cartesian philosophy. I think, therefore I am. The experience of the self is really the ultimate. Then you have some developments. We'll say developments in Western culture. Because you have the advent of evolutionary theory in biology and the advent of psychological theory. And I say theory because when Freud kind of starts making his mark in the 19th century, you're finding an individual who is theorizing about a lot of things, but that leaves space open for loads of other interpretations. So you don't just have Freudian psychotherapy, you have Jungian theory, all these different things that over the past 150 years have developed. So
that's why we keep Chris on the podcast, by the way, because he paid attention in history class.
I did pay attention. It didn't help or didn't hurt. My dad was a civics teacher. Nice. So, but that being said, you get to the turning point, the century mark between the 1800s and the 1900s, and this had so influenced, psychological theory and evolutionary theory. It so influenced the European Theological Academy. This is, I'm part German, so I can say this, that the Germans did it, right? Those Germans in German theological circles really started embracing these schools of thought.
Yeah.
That then influences those who will come over to the United States potentially to teach in the theological seminaries here, so that by the time you get to 1900, a lot of what was going across people's radars as Christian theology was at best what you may have learned as social gospel, right?
Okay.
So social gospel, upward mobility, people can help themselves, and you should be a good person, a nice person, be a Carnegie, and you should invest in others by donating large sums of money, because at the end of the day...
You're talking Dale Carnegie, win friends and influence people?
No.
I'm serious. What, you said Carnegie? What is that?
Yeah, Andrew Carnegie.
Okay.
Wealthy dude,
okay,
19th
gotcha.
century, yeah. So, he makes loads of money. And so he gives, all these Carnegie libraries around the country.
Okay.
These are all from, his endowments and everything. So you have people who are doing these things, and what has then settled on the public the public estimation of Christianity was that you had really maybe three things, right? One is you have Roman Catholicism, which until 1960, when you have JFK, the idea of having a Roman Catholic president was not even really tenable. I mean, a Roman Catholic president was the questions were, will he have allegiance to the Pope? Will the Pope be calling shots in the United States? So when we think about Christianity in pre-1960 America, we're not even thinking about Roman Catholicism at that point. We're thinking of Protestantism.
Okay.
So which branches of Protestantism are being represented? At this point in time, you have mainline Protestantism, which is we will say in America, your historic Protestant denominations like what is now the ELCA, the UCC. You have the
oldest buildings in town, those churches.
Largely, yeah.
The churches that were built in 1850.
Exactly.
A lot of the resurgent denominations from a conservative theological standpoint were in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and the 1900s. So they just didn't have, like, if you look at that old Gothic architecture or whatever the building is, like, that's a mainline church.
Likely it was, yeah. And so when you have these developments occurring, there is really a crisis of theological conscience that takes place, because you've got to square with the fact that what's being believed and taught as Christianity is help people, because you have done what Friedrich Schleiermacher advocated for, is desupernaturalization. Mm-hmm. To say, okay, you know what, let's take all the miracles out of Christianity. What does that leave us with? That leaves us with, you should love your neighbor as yourself. And so that really does influence the theological academy.
Schleiermacher was an experiential guy, right? Doesn't really matter if the resurrection happened, just matters if you believe in the resurrection.
What was the resurrection for you, practically?
So if you believe in resurrection power, that's as good as Jesus actually being raised from the dead.
Yeah, and so this is, you can understand how this fits with Cartesian thought, right? So René Descartes, and you think, okay, if the measure of legitimacy and experience is the self, and how do you experience the world? Well, man, your theology is going to follow suit with that, because what does it matter if there was a resurrection? If I believe it, then it matters. Now, that might sound familiar to you if you're listening right now, because you're like, yeah, that's kind of the ethos. That's the atmosphere we live in. And yes, that is exactly right, which is why theological liberalism is dying in its formal manifestations. You will find in most communities, if it's any size, right? Let's say you get over 15,000 people in a community, you're going to find that most of those communities have buildings that are vacant or have been sold to be used by perhaps a younger conservative church at times.
Yep.
Because the churches have died, and we'll talk about this further in a bit, I'm sure, but there's no theological teeth to it, right?
Sure.
There's nothing that bites. And so Machen has this background. Everything has led up to this point, and he's saying, "Look, we've got to deal with this, because this doesn't look like Christianity at all. This looks more like culture. This more like good person culture."
So there's an interesting lesson here: is even groups that would say other groups are just historically conditioned. Like we don't believe in that resurrection thing now, even though they did. those groups are themselves historically conditioned.
Right.
So the people denying certain elements of the gospel because of its supernatural, the resurrection, we can't really believe that exists anymore, is because of a historical conditioning.
Yeah, and subjectivism will always fail.
There's a humility in understanding that. It's not that Chris and I and our listeners are the only ones that are not historically conditioned. It's all of us swim in a certain water. All of us are in a milieu, as you said. All of us are in a zeitgeist, and we need to be aware. Well, actually, one of the only ways you can be aware of that is to see another milieu. And the Bible presents us multiple different cultural vantage points where we can go, oh, maybe this is actually just something that's residing in my current location. But the problem with liberalism is it was a conforming of Christian doctrine to the cultural location, to the historical moment. And that historical moment would not allow for the supernatural.
And a reductionism, which I think is an important thing as we, maybe if, you're listening right now and you surf, we'll use old millennial language right now, you surf over to a webpage of a mainline liberal church, and you'll look and say, oh, but it says we hold to the Westminster Confession of Faith. And it's like, but do you? Do you really? Because there's an historical tie here, but at the end of the day, what is the burden of that particular, organization, that individual? And it is ultimately going to be attached to what do I think? What do I feel? Yeah. That's where we go.
Okay, so we got a historical background. Give me a quick hitter. What doctrines were getting denied in the early 1900s?
Yeah, so we would talk about the virgin birth of Christ. We would talk about the deity of Christ. We would see discussion of the inerrancy of Scripture.
Inerrancy of Scripture has to be denied because can we really believe that fallible men who can err could write?
Can be reliable sources, right?
Well, from our perspective, we would say if God makes it happen, we can believe that.
Correct.
But if you take out the God makes it happen portion of something, then a lot of things seem a lot less reasonable.
Yeah.
If God raises a body from the dead, sure, I can believe that can happen. If God...
Yeah, the resurrection is a big deal.
If God works through fallible human instruments to make a divinely unerring word, I can believe that happens as long as my emphasis is on God's ability to do so, but that's a supernatural emphasis. And so if you're in an Enlightenment time that says the supernatural is backwards, it's untenable anymore, we can't think like that, you're going to deny these things that have to have supernatural components.
Yeah, denying the resurrection, denying the miracles of Jesus, denying things like the Red Sea, the direct creation of humanity by God Almighty, God's judgment of the world in the flood of Noah's day. All these things are denied as antiquated and pre-modern thought.
Yeah. Okay, so there's categorical denial of significant doctrine such that Machen says this is a different religion. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here today, is that effectively at what point do you call something a different religion? Usually it's not going to be because of one error. It's not going to be because of a difference in beliefs on spiritual gifts or a difference in practice on baptism or a difference in even how you describe the institution of the church. On any one of those things, you're not going to go different religion.
Right.
But when you start to combine 4, 6, 12, and you start to see a webbing, I think you might have mentioned this in another podcast, where typically if you're going to dip into heresy, it's not just one thing, but things come along with each other. So you start to see a webbing of different problems and say, for instance, Jehovah's Witness talk about the Jesus as the first creation, and they talk about the Spirit as an impersonal force, and
denying hell.
Or if Mormons have a belief in the continued temple practice, and you start to add these things together, and you say this is a different religion because it has a different nature of God, a different nature of Christ, a different means of salvation, and a different view of heaven. Yeah. And so this is a different worldview, a different faith. And really that's what you find with liberalism theologically.
I'll say this in terms of personal experience. Josh, the church, and I'll use that term loosely right now, the church that I grew up at is an ELCA church, and I drive past it with some frequency, as I live in the town I grew up in, and I drive past it, and on the outside of the building. And here's the heartbreaking thing, Josh, is I remember I became a Christian when I was 17. So I grew up in a church-going home with wonderful parents who taught me to respect the scriptures and go to church and everything. And I can track the regress. I won't say the progress, the regress of the denomination I grew up in. But I drive past today this building that I remember when they built this addition on, that I went and I prayed on that site where they had that addition, and just spent time out there praying. And now hanging outside of that space as a huge banner, I would say it's probably maybe a good 8 feet or 10 feet in height by 3 feet, 4 feet in width, is a transgender banner.
Yeah.
That has the rainbow with transgender modification symbols on it, saying like, all are welcome, we're about acceptance and inclusion, whatever. So, I mean, this is a real deal. This is a very real deal.
And this where it matters, I think you mentioned that part of the Mormon gospel is someone knocks on your door, and one of the things they forefront is be with your family forever.
Right.
So part of the good news is be with your family forever. Well, that's at the very least an alteration of the good news,
right?
Because it's an alteration of what the fundamental problem is and what the fundamental solution is, and the product of that solution. So the problem is no longer sin and rebellion against the God who created you. Mm-hmm. The solution is no longer the perfect moral goodness of Jesus in your place, on your behalf, gifted to you. And the product of that is no longer reconciliation and peace with God, which you get to enjoy now and unto eternity. The problem is
injustice, social injustice.
Well, so there's the Mormon problem, but then you have the gospel is all are welcome, right? And so when you reduce the supernatural components of the gospel, you do still need a new gospel. You still need to proclaim something,
right?
And that proclamation becomes all are welcome. And so one of the things I want to do here, because we're about halfway through this podcast and we're going to do a whole nother worldview. So we're just kind of touching base on this, just to give you a flavor of this is how you identify when something is a different religion, not just a flavor of Christianity. One of the things I think devotionally is super important here, Chris, is Machen. I was poking through the first half of his book the other day, and he makes the point that it's not just we turn our nose up at people who deny the supernatural, but it's our very hope is a supernatural hope.
Right.
And so as Christian people, we can't do with any form of looking down upon supernatural things,
right? Because
all of the good things God does in us, for us, through us are not natural in terms of our mind. The rebirth of our hearts is not a natural thing. Our sanctification, how we grow in holiness, is not a natural thing. They're called fruits of the Spirit for a reason.
Right.
They're not fruits of your disciplined effort.
Right.
Constantly you read Paul saying that he wants and others to be strengthened by the graces in Christ Jesus. Even as you read the beginnings of Paul's letters, what does he say? Grace and peace from Jesus.
Yeah.
How do you say that unless Jesus can actually do that? Is that just an empty statement? It's like, I got to say something nice.
So let's talk about Jesus.
I remember reading Revelation and having this revelation that when John is saying grace and peace effectively from the Pantocrator, the Almighty God, and the resurrected Jesus, and the seven spirits of living God, he actually means that God can transmit that to you.
Yeah.
That's supernatural. Like when you pray for someone, we were talking about this with Ecclesiastes 5. There's a great evil in this world, according to Ecclesiastes 5 and Ecclesiastes 6. And the evil is this: the rich man has good things and can't enjoy them. Right in between two bookends of great evil is this bright light, Ecclesiastes 5, 18 through 20, that says, to anyone whom God has given wealth and possessions and the power to enjoy them.
Yeah.
If we don't believe in supernatural, we don't believe God can do things that aren't in our own power or in our own framework, we don't believe he can give us the power to enjoy. We don't believe he can give us the power to overcome sin. We don't believe he can resurrect our bodies. The things that actually birth hope in us, we don't believe he can do if we don't believe in the supernatural. Right. And so this is not just an intellectual conversation, and it's not just, as we're saying, different flavors of Christianity. The very core of our hope in the living God is, we were talking about this morning, Romans 4. Although Abraham looked at his body and said, it's as good as dead, and he looked at the deadness of his wife's womb, he did not lose hope. Why? Because he knew the God who could raise the dead
is able. Yeah.
His hope, supernatural hope. He looked at natural things and said, no hope.
Ain't gonna work.
But he knew the God who could raise the dead.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Josh, and you think, before we transition to, our next flip side worldview here in postmodern times, is that you have the Apostle Paul, who finishes writing to a church that felt themselves to be very competent, the church of Corinth. And they like, hey, you know what? We've got rhetoricians. We got so many impressive people here. And Paul gets to the end of the letter, and he's like, look, there's a problem here in that some people are denying the resurrection. They're denying that this is going to happen. They've denied perhaps that Jesus himself was raised from the dead. But no big deal, because we have a secret hidden wisdom, right? And so Paul spends his time talking here, but he gets to the end of the letter and he says, if Christ hasn't been raised from the dead, we are, of all people, Christian people, most to be pitied, because our entire life and lifestyle is predicated on a supernatural event that occurred in human history. Yeah. And now for the theological liberal, this is kind of one of those like, oh, how convenient moments say, well, but that wasn't really Paul. It's like, at what point, and this is the question that's being asked here, at what point does it stop being Christianity? And it stops being Christianity when you're asking was that really? When the question from the serpent in the garden of did God really save begins to color all of your interpretation of historically held theological truths, you have to at least be intellectually honest enough to say, yeah, this isn't Christianity, right? Yeah,
I mean, you're in Romans, I'll be in Romans in the fall. And what is it 15 or 16, the declaration soon? It's an ironic but beautiful way to put it. Soon, the God of peace will crush
Satan,
the head of the enemy.
Yep.
One, he's going to bring peace. He is the God of peace by crushing the serpent. Who's the serpent? A supernatural enemy. What's God going to do? A supernatural victory. When Paul says, wretched man that I am, he looks at his body.
Who will deliver me?
He looks at his body and he says, I know it's good to do, but I don't do it. I know it's bad to do, and I still do it. Who will deliver me from this body, this natural body of death? Thanks be to God in Christ Jesus, the resurrected Lord. And if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, what will he do?
He will raise your mortal body.
He's going to give life to your mortal body. And so the entirety of the hope of the Christian is God working on his initiative, by his grace, through his power in our hearts to do all things. And yes, we participate. But the emphasis is on God's divine power and graciousness to empower us, to strengthen us, to grow us. And if we start denying supernatural things, man, all our hope goes by the wayside real quick. So I would say that's really and what we've tried to show this is that bankrupt religions bankrupt our hope. They're not just wrong intellectually. Like, we are a time to think. We both like to think, but ultimately these thoughts are supposed to dig through stuff so we can see clearly the beauty, the hope, the goodness of Jesus. Yeah. And so you can't deny supernatural because our Lord himself is he's pretty supernatural.
Out of this world.
He's out of
this world.
Yeah. And somehow in this world because he's supernatural. This is kind of an interesting segue because we're going from a denial of the supernatural to a new interest in the supernatural, because we see in a lot of different parts of our culture that people realize, looking around and saying, the only stuff that exists is the stuff that I see and taste and touch, has left people going, there's got to be more than that.
Yes.
Once again, historical moment. So let's clue our mind that a lot of different rebirths of religious movements are historically conditioned. So you have years and years and years, decades, and a millennia of... Was millennia 1,000?
It is.
You don't have a millennia of it. You got a couple centuries of denial of the supernatural. And then all of a sudden people are like, there's got to be more than just the natural.
We were meant to live for so much more. Have we lost ourselves? Anyway, sorry for the Switchfoot reference.
Oh, man. That's great. I didn't even have anything better to say. And so what you have is a renewed interest in mysticism. How would you define mysticism? I don't really have a nailed down definition.
Yeah, so I mean, given that most religions have a supernatural element, okay, so we'll just grant that to be the case. I think we want to differentiate mysticism from supernaturalism, because supernaturalism would include any religion that believes in something that is not of this material natural order, right?
Okay.
So reason we'll call like New Age. That's kind of an antiquated term. Are you going to
overlap New Age and mysticism?
Yeah, I would.
Venn diagram, is it totally overlapped, or is there?
I think depending on the practice of the individual, I would say there's a high degree of overlap. Mysticism emphasizes the practice, New Age probably the form of that practice. But at the end of the day, when we think about mysticism, what we're really doing here is we're looking at, and I don't want to say that it's without community, because there are covens, right? Gatherings of people who call themselves witches. There are groups that will gather in groves, druids, contemporary druids who are mystical in their worldview and how they practice spirituality. But I would say some of the defining marks of mysticism would be the ability of an individual to control supernatural forces through practices that typically involve nature, that involve the transcendence of the self as a thinking entity.
You're going to have to drill that down for me. The transcendence of the self as a thinking entity.
So one of the most popular things that exists today among celebrities in their spirituality is transcendental meditation. So TM, and people have probably heard that term. And what that's effectively saying is, because they won't pray in the traditional sense of the word, pray to a deity, they would say, well, but we have to, and it's not just meditation where somebody might sit there and think about stuff. Transcendental meditation is advocating for the individual to kind of transcend themselves, get outside of themselves. And I mean, if people understand the real history of it, it's astral projection, people who are literally believe they're projecting their souls into the spiritual realm. My mom, when she was, I think in her 20s, encountered a guy who was a practitioner of Eckankar, which is a real deep dive in terms of the history of New Age spiritualities. And
yeah, I've never dove that deep.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. There's something called the Grand Eckmaster. I mean, that's my mom would joke about this because they would have this thing on public, or it was like cable access television, the local programming, and they would run these types of things. But this guy claimed that he could project himself while he was sleeping and go shopping in his sleep. So he could go to stores and window shop, and then he would make his decisions in his sleep, and then wake up and go and do the shopping.
So he didn't actually claim that he purchased anything in his sleep?
Nope, just browsed. So,
okay.
TM, this type of stuff has a history that has now been, in many respects, sanitized because the people who practice this don't necessarily want to be seen as Looney Tunes, right? So they don't want to be, they might say something like, I use crystals, the healing power of crystals, or I use incense in order to promote personal spirituality. But they won't say, and the reason I use this particular thing is because it has a history within groups of witches. Okay. So like, I think sage burning is some of this, not like burning sages, but you have these.
Sorry, it took me a minute to get
Yeah. So the plant, and so they'll have these bundles and they'll burn them and believe that there's a spiritual thing occurring. Even things as what we would call primitive, and I don't say this to be condescending, but primitive, meaning that you and I would have probably grown up hearing about certain spiritual practices of like native tribes and everything, like sweat lodges, right? Think about something like ayahuasca,
right?
Okay, so love Aaron Rodgers. He grew up in a Christian home, and here's a sad, probably this is a microcosm, right, of somebody who grows up in a Christian culture. But finds dissatisfaction because he doesn't like the fact that his sin is being called out. And so he wants to find a substitute spirituality. So he goes on darkness retreats in caves and drinks psychedelic stuff.
Can I tell you one of my favorite moments of all time? And I'm not even exaggerating.
Yeah, I mean,
this is like a top 5 moment of all time. When Aaron Rodgers with his first season with the Jets, and he has this long form interview with Fox Sports, maybe Aaron Andrews, I don't know who it was at the time.
Probably Aaron Andrews.
And discusses some of these spiritual practices and talks about manifesting. And then within a drive, he tears his Achilles.
Yep, Achilles goes.
And I thought, dog, you didn't manifest enough.
Right.
But here's a point, if you're paying attention, of this desire to control the supernatural, this manifestation.
Right.
that doesn't actually change the natural. Now, it doesn't mean that no spiritual practice, you can tamper with the wrong spirits, and there are real ramifications. I think what is interesting about the way you defined kind of the New Age practice is it's believing that there's some sort of spiritual charge more than the material, but it's a believing you can manipulate that.
Correct.
And that's going to be a huge difference between a biblical understanding of who God is as one who personally is present in and through his creation. Think about all the different in him and through him and to him are all things, or in him all things hold together, or things like that, where God is personally present in the physical withholding of the universe and also in activity in the universe. The key difference is he's personally present. It's not the universe is charged with supernatural energy. It's God is here. And God is not manipulatable.
Yes.
We can pray to him. We can ask him for things. He will even respond to our prayers because he's a good father, but he's not manipulatable. And so that's going to be two huge differences. Again, it's not that the universe is charged, it's that God is here. And it's not that you can control the charge, it's that God's in charge.
And here's where different, like for the individual who might say, yeah, well, what about the Christian player who's, goes out, he's praying, God, I'm going to have a good season, first drive of the season, ACL goes out, right? And you think, oh, well, how is it any different? Here's how it's different. And it's exactly for the reason that you just said. So for anybody who might have that objection, or anybody who might be thinking like, yeah, but what about? It's because the difference is found in that the New Age practice suggests that if you do enough, if you think hard enough, like this idea of manifesting, it's mind-boggling in the fact that so many people who seem to be reasonably intelligent believe that if you think hard enough, you're going to get something. Now, that seems to work for people who have the things already, because if you go into the inner city of Chicago and you tell somebody who is living on the streets, hey, just think hard enough about having a great spot downtown. Just go on the waterfront, go down the lake shore, and just look at this building and think hard enough that you're going to get the penthouse. It ain't working, right? It's not working. But New Age spirituality,
Tim Keller used to talk about the difference between preaching that would work in Manhattan and that would work in Brooklyn.
Right, exactly.
And he was making the point that people that are impoverished, they want a crucifixion, an atonement, and a resurrection. Because there's a problem that needs to be solved. People that are affluent, you can take a little lighter spirituality because many of your perceived problems are already solved.
Yes, and this is where it almost kind of comes full circle, because there's the unique nature of those who practice New Age spirituality now is typically privileged individuals. These are typically wealthy individuals. You won't find a lot of people in poverty who are out doing this. Now, there are some, to be sure, but at the end of the day, you're finding people who have made themselves in their own minds, thinking, well, I've made myself, I still feel empty, so what can I do to fill that emptiness?
Can make my own spirituality.
Yeah, if they have denied the God who is, where do we ultimately get? And here's the full circle nature of it is people are, we'll say, returning to paganism. Literally, the practices that were engaged in thousands of years ago by people who had no access to the scriptures and to a biblical worldview, people who would literally, in order to manipulate the gods, would sacrifice human beings. Now, I'm not saying that those who are doing transcendental meditation are sacrificing children. I'm simply saying that if we don't
you're saying the tie is the ability to manipulate the divine.
Yes.
Whether that's through human sacrifice or crystals or any posture that says, I have the ability to manipulate the divine energy or the divine person or to appease the gods. Because why do you appease the gods? So that they will do a thing that you would like them to do. So there's this manipulation element. That's huge and core to the, I think when I preached on the Holy Spirit back in December, my introduction was, what's the most frustrating thing for you about God? And the question I was begging was that he's not controllable.
Yeah.
He's not controllable because he's a person and the Spirit's a person. And I was trying to get people to see that the wind blows where he wishes.
Yeah.
When we worship God as Christian people, we worship a God who's not dictated by us. Once again, he meaningfully hears us. He's involved in our lives. He cares for us. He knows what we need. But ultimately speaking, he's not directed by us. Even at the idea of sacrifice. We don't come to church because we think we're going to get God to do what we want him to do. I mentioned this to you that Ecclesiastes 7 says, be not overly righteous, lest you destroy yourself, be not overly wise. And the point seems to be that don't live your life being so morally good that you think it will control things.
Yeah.
So there's all different ways that we as humans try to control things. One of them would be through righteousness. I will live such a good life that bad cannot happen to me. And when it does, I can effectively demand of God, you should not have let that happen to me because look, I've been good.
Yeah.
And is that categorically different than trying to manipulate the divine? In some ways, but it's also still this human-centered, I can control things through my own will, my own power, my own intuition. And this came up, Chris, because I was watching Frozen 2 last night. And I'll admit, I took a nap in the middle of it. So I got more than bits and pieces, but I didn't get the kind of... my wife and I are not super fun to watch movies with because we like to pick them apart. But I didn't get the like Josh laser-focused pick-apart energy. I just kind of had the passive engagement energy. And still... I found Frozen 2 to be this weird mixture of New Age spirituality and human-centered salvation. So you've got this story, which Frozen 1 is basically a story of someone breaking out of their shell,
empowered,
tamped down in their upbringing, but now she's free, except for when she becomes free, she hurts everybody. Let's not talk about that part. But eventually love and relationship fix the day. Great. In that way, Frozen 1 wasn't really about the supernatural. The whole ice thing was just a proxy to get the story
about character arc,
love and relationship and breaking your shell. Frozen 2 was totally about the supernatural. That was the whole plot. And so you have this people group who is magical, and you've got this normal people group, and they get into a fight. You find out in the end why. And because they get into a fight, these elemental forces, these 4 elemental forces get angry, it seems.
It's like Captain Planet.
It's water, earth, fire, and air. They like cover the forest so that no one can enter. And then Elsa, the main character, has to go on this journey of finding out that she is actually the 5th spirit. So there's 4 spirits, but she's the 5th spirit that completes them all.
In Captain Planet, that one was Heart. Mati. Anyways, keep going.
So this whole story is about this kind of nature being supercharged, and some people having this magical relationship to nature, and then nature reacting in a supernatural way against violence, and then ultimately this salvation story of this single individual. But even then, it's not the single individual; it's her sister has to help. And then the end is some weird declaration of how love finds a way. And so it's just this super odd...
love finds a way.
Yeah, it's this kind of odd combination of New Age spirituality and vague affirmation of love. And I bring that up because that movie doesn't get made unless there's people that want to watch that.
Or want others to watch that, right?
And so you've got this narrative that is built totally on the fact that the nature is charged with forces, and those forces can, in their own way, get angry. There's a moral posture to those forces, but then a human being can control those forces, and then ultimately unite all things back together. And I got weird and read a couple different articles. Some were claiming Elsa is a Christ figure. Others were strictly mystic. And every time they mentioned Jesus, it was a distortion of who Jesus is. So this one writer said, X water in, this water feature in the movie is really the Prince of Peace, just like Jesus, the Prince of Peace. So every time he mentioned Jesus, it was this ripping of language from the Bible to reappropriate it. But I mention that because you've got this cultural artifact, fairly popular, that is trying to paint the world as supercharged with spirituality and match that together with this kind of human-centered salvation. And I just sat there going, this is dumb. Because from a Christian perspective, it's so empty.
Right.
You can start to pick apart any of these things, and I don't know. What are your reflections? I don't know I have much more other than I thought it was empty, but also clamoring for this idea of the supernatural.
Yeah, I was going to say, and this is works off of this, I guess, but was reading A Magician's Nephew with the kids the other...
Better story.
Yeah, a much better story. About maybe a month ago, I was reading this, and we're getting towards the end. And as we're talking here, I'm thinking, how do we portray the God who is? Like, how do we actually communicate who he is in a way that might even, like, Jungian psychology talks about like the types, the archetypes, right? The hero's journey and all these types of things. And so we know that baked into literary history, baked into culture, people have aspirations. They have things that's like, this makes sense. This is desirable. And we would say this isn't a grand, psychological sharing moment, that this is built into the human heart by God to say this is important, this is valuable, this kind of thing. But as we think, like, what's a good way to portray a worldview that does justice to this two-sided coin that right now is like people are searching for something, right? It's like, well, I got to search for meaning in myself, or I've got to search for meaning in myself, but outside of myself by manipulating what's outside of myself. I was thinking of Aslan and thinking about how does C.S. Lewis, a man who was caught up in the very turn of the century, modernism that basically denies the supernatural. The guy who says his conversion was like, hey, I went on a ride one day and I came back a Christian effectively after like this stuff like rattling in my head. It's like, it happened. I don't know how it happened. I didn't make it happen. And so he gives us a picture of in Aslan. I'm thinking The Magician's Nephew, the creation of Narnia and what's happening. And the things that are said about Aslan, they're so like, they're tear inducing to me at times. Like even just thinking about it now, it's like there's kind of restraining some tears.
You're going to make yourself cry.
I'm going to make myself cry, exactly.
No one thought that.
Nobody else
minutes
except
ago,
for
no
me.
one got that.
I know. But just the way that Lewis puts words in Aslan's mouth that you know full well what he's doing. And he is telling us, like, if you want to know what God is like, allegorically, this unapologetic allegory in many ways that Lewis is writing this. He's like, imagine this fierce, like potentially mauling lion who could just tear anybody to shreds, who has all this power, who is speaking or singing the world into existence as it is. And yet he is also approachable by this diggory, right? Yeah. This fellow who comes and he's like, my mom is sick. Can you help my mom? And he's not manipulating. He doesn't dare manipulate. He goes to him and is like, could you please help? And what does Aslan do? I mean, you remember Magician, what he does when he asks him? He cries, right? Like he sheds tears and he's like, my boy, I understand. And so it's like Diggory knows in that moment that nobody knows this better than he does, basically. Yeah. And Lewis was acquainted with some grief and suffering. And so, like, what does this say about who God is? Like, when we think about a very popular, accessible image that we see is like, man, God is not everything, right? So we're not dealing with pantheism, with panentheism, which is what New Age spirituality is ultimately getting at. This idea like, oh, well, God is everything. He's everyone. And so it's not even a he, it's just this force. And we tap into this force and manipulate. And Lewis would say, like, that's insane. That's absolutely crazy. There's nothing to that at all. But then you think, what is the spirituality or the lack thereof of liberalism? It's to say, like, oh, you know what, just deny this. Let's be rational selves. And he would say, that's not true. Yeah. You know that this isn't everything. And so when you see this like marriage, this beautiful marriage in Aslan of an approachable and yet fierce creator who identifies the creation but is not the creation itself, it's such a beautiful picture, which is why, like, you think, what is the power of story, historically speaking? Is that, like, why is Frozen 2 not a religion, right? Why do people not come to Frozen 2 and say, I want to build my life on this? It's because people know it's empty. It's attractive, but at the end of the day, it doesn't work. Why is Jesus, why is he so appealing among, all the different reasons we can talk about? Why is he so appealing to people in a broken world? It's because he's not tameable, right? But he's accessible. You can approach Jesus and say, I need you to help me. And he may very well say, I'm going to help you differently than you want, but I'm still here. And so like what a remedy that is to a worldview otherwise.
I remember reading a book about the friendship of Jesus and having this line dawn on me that Jesus won't be used, but he will be had. And there's a good dynamic here of, man, if I'm in the confessional booth right now, far too often I try to leverage Jesus.
Yep.
Far too often my relationship to him is, I want help with a sermon, I want help with this counseling thing, I want help with the church. And Jesus has been mercifully clear over the years of, brother, you're leveraging me. And we all do that. We try to use the Lord. And we need to remember that the Lord won't be used, but he will be had.
Yeah.
He will be yours. The gospel is not just God is. From Leviticus on, I mean, the good news of who God is he will be your God and you will be his people. He will be yours. He will walk among you, but he won't be used.
Don't mess around with him, right?
and I think that's a freeing. I've told people in Ecclesiastes that the preacher is trying to frustrate them in order to free them, and he's going to really frustrate you.
Yep.
And sometimes you need to be really frustrated. And so, as we're talking about the threadings between an anti-supernaturalism in liberalism, or a supernaturalism in mystics, I think it both of them lead to a frustrated self. Both of them lead to a frustrated, self-centered existence.
Yeah.
And the reality of being self-centered is it's kind of a frustrating existence. Thinking about yourself all the time is pretty frustrating. I think Gavin Ortlund in his book on humility calls it the suffocating narrowness of the self. The more you look inward, the more frustrating it is. You eventually see you can't make others do what you want them to do. You can't manifest. You can't control the divine. You can't morally, you need the supernatural because you can't just get yourself up by your bootstraps morally. Yourself is frustrated. And then what do you do with that frustrated self? You look at Christ. And he is a Christ who won't be used.
Yeah.
You're not gonna pigeonhole him into what you want him to do, but he will be had. You can have him.
Yeah, he's not a tame lion, but he's good.
But he's good, yeah. And so you can have all that Christ is by faith. I love 1 Corinthians 30. Because of God, we have in Christ. Sorry, what is it? Because we are in Christ, he is our righteousness, redemption, sanctification, and wisdom. He's everything to us because we're in him. And how do we get in Christ? By faith. We confess he's Lord. We trust him. And when we do that, we get all that he is.
Yeah.
We can't use him, but we get him.
Yeah.
And there's this goodness of being taken outside of your frustrated self, freed from that frustration by apprehending, by grabbing, laying hold of Christ, getting all that he is, and then living the rest of your life going, all right, Lord, you are in control. I am not.
Yeah.
I trust you. I know you. I can't manipulate you, but I can have you. This has been a time to think.